Earning your degree online doesn't mean you have to go about it alone. At Capella University, we're here to support you when you're ready. From enrollment counselors who get to know you and your goals, to academic coaches who can help you form a plan to stay on track. We care about your success and are dedicated to helping you pursue your goals. Going back to school is a big step, but having support at every step of your academic journey can make a big difference. Imagine your future differently at capella.edu.
I'm Vass, and I host this Globe and Mail podcast called Lately.
And I'm Katrina Onstad, and I am the show's executive producer.
You're also an Olympic superfan, which I adore about you. How stoked are you for the Summer Games in Paris? And why do you have face paint on right now?
Hey, that's a lie. I feel like you're shaming me for my affection for the Olympics. Like, I am aware that Olympics bashing is another kind of sport, especially when they come around. And you don't have to convince me, okay? There's excellent reporting on the terrible environmental footprint of the games. We all know how they're often economically dubious for host cities. Montreal took 30 years to pay down its debt from the 1976 Olympics, so I get it. People are defecating in the Seine as we speak to make a point about this. But I'm going to say I love the Olympics. I just do. I find it very moving to see these athletes achieving at the highest levels. And these people, are not professionals, most of them. Some of them are now, but most of them have put in so much time and a lot of their own money into this one narrow passion, and not often for financial gain. Most of them do not come out with these $1 million sponsorships, right? And so I refuse to be a Grinch about it. So there's my pro-Olympics rant, Vass. Leave me alone.
I didn't mean to tease you.
So what about you? What are you going to watch? Or will you?
I don't have anything marked in my calendar yet. My kind of joke is I've always wondered why water sliding isn't at the Summer Olympics as a complement to bobsledding. I thought I could become a contender.
Oh, yeah.
That's how I see myself, at a future games.
I think, you could get sponsorship for that, I think.
I'm working on finding the best slides around the world. And this week, we want to talk about how those good feelings you described, that romance, that achievement, that kind of halo element of the games and other sporting events can be harnessed to sports wash. And that word doesn't refer to laundering your biker shorts or wiping off a sweaty fencing mask. Sports washing is a term used to describe the practice of governments or corporations using sports to improve their reputations. Now, Saudi Arabia tends to be the case study here. They've spent billions into hoovering up events like the PGA Golf Tour and the 2030 World Cup. And they have a pretty terrible human rights track record. Also, Gulf nations are changing sports. They've bought up a bunch of teams in the English Premier League, and that's a shift in ownership, not sponsorship, but the same forces are at play.
And there was a really good column in the Globe and Mail recently by Simon Haupt, which looks at this phenomenon. And he asks if we should be raising an eyebrow at the investments of big brands as much as we do repressive regimes. Like, is our scrutiny sometimes selective? It's interesting. So we invited him in to talk about it.
Yes. So on today's very Olympic episode, we discuss the history and economy of sports washing. Simon Haupt covers sports, media, and the business of sports for the Globe and Mail, and he wrote that excellent column, which we're going to link to in our show notes. He's also a former baseball player who broke his nose one time too many. That's something he told me. It's not a comment on his face. Okay, this is Lately. I was thinking one of the first things we should do out the gate is ask you to define sports washing for us.
Sure. Sports washing is a relatively new term. It's about 10 years old. It's one of those made-up terms,
My favorite kind. Yeah.
Well, it's a portmanteau, as they say. Sports and washing, and refers to this practice of using sports to cleanse or cover up something that is perceived to be dirty. It was first used in 2015 by an Azerbaijan critic of her country's regime and its human rights abuses. But basically, it's nowadays used most commonly to refer to the practice of repressive regimes. These might be, Russia or China or some of the Gulf oil nations, using sports to distract people both inside the country and especially outside from their human rights abuses.
I think those are two really key words, cleanse and distract. Let's talk about an example. Qatar in the World Cup. Why would a Middle Eastern emirate with fewer than 3 million people and kind of little in the way of soccer tradition want to host the sport's biggest event at a reported cost to them of some $220 billion?
It's a great question. That's a key question. You could say some of these Gulf oil nations, they see $100 or $200 billion as funny money. I mean,
right.
Really what we're talking about when we're talking about sports washing is a sort of cultural diplomacy, right? It's soft power. And like this is something that every country engages in the broad category of really, I mean, you could say marketing that sports washing belongs to. This is persuasion, this is spreading their values. And back up for a second, I mean, America has been doing this for decades. During the Cold War, the State Department used to send jazz musicians like Dizzy Gillespie and some of the more avant-garde poets and writers around the world to spread American values. And that is cultural diplomacy. That is exercising soft power. Canada does it too. For a number of years, I was based in New York for the Globe. And every July 1st, the Department of Foreign Affairs would host a concert in Central Park for Canada Day. And some of Canada's greatest musicians played there, Tragically Hip, Feist, and Broken Social Scene. And, Pamela Wallen, who was then the Consul General, explained to me that this is a way of kind of opening conversations with, it could be Americans, it could be all kinds of people from around the world, to the values that Canada holds. And so Qatar saw the World Cup as a great way to advertise. What it said was its new openness. There were cultural elements to the Qatar World Cup. There were sculptures in the desert and, all kinds of fantastic things that people could do, not just watching soccer. And this was, cultural diplomacy.
So what is it about sports specifically that is attractive to, I guess, dubious regimes, but maybe regimes of all kind? What is the particular shine that these countries are hoping might rub off on them?
Nelson Mandela once said, sport has the power to change the world. And, he recognized it was a meeting place where all humanity could work out their differences and show the best of what it was to be human. I mean, look, there's this purity to sport and a connection to human achievement that, frankly, stretches back thousands of years.
Yeah.
Certainly back to the original Olympic Games. And look, do you play sport?
Yeah, I play pickup basketball.
Excellent. Good for you. So I don't know whether that started in your childhood, but most of us play sports as children, right? It's how many of us learn to work together in teams.
Wait, what do you play? Are you an individual sport guy or are you a team sport guy?
Well, I don't play a lot anymore. I suffered many injuries playing baseball.
Okay.
I broke my leg. I broke my nose at least once playing baseball. But, you're, I believe, a relatively new mother, right?
Yes. Wow. Who's done their homework for this episode? I know. I'll be playing that new mom card as long as I can.
Right.
Just kidding.
At some point, I presume you'll put him into some kind of sports as a toddler or a young kid, and he will push himself and he will achieve great things, and he will also suffer terrible loss. And that is really the training ground for life. And so that's one of the elements that makes sport so attractive. And we're about to embark on the Olympics. This is 3 weeks of the Olympics and the Paralympics. And it's one of the few communal experiences that we have anymore. Even though we're all going to be watching different events, CBC will have their main channel, and they'll also be broadcasting on 2 TSN channels and 2 Sportsnet channels, but there will be dozens of streams on CBC's app. And so we're all going to be watching, on the one hand, different things, but on the other hand, the same thing. It is going to be this communal experience that millions are going to be engaged in. And so if you're a marketer, you want to capitalize, I think, not just on the large audience, but also, on the positive feelings and that kind of warm and fuzzy fellow feeling that these kinds of events bring.
Mm-hmm. It has been said that the Olympics have actually always invited sport washing. Do you know this myth or story of Athens and Sparta in 416 BCE?
So I'm trying to remember, is that the Alcibiades moment?
Yeah, like, why don't I do my history version of it and
Please.
you decode it for me? Okay.
Sure.
So here's a quick thumbnail. At the time, there was this ongoing brutal war between Athens and Sparta. And Athens is losing the war, I'll say this is historically accurate, big time. So an Athenian politician enters a bunch of Athenians in a chariot race, and they win. This is like an F1 racing team. And now Athens is sort of really energized, right? Their people are feeling like, who's the loser now? Athens is number one. What do you think? Is that sport washing, or is that just sports?
Certainly, I think if we think about it in modern context, that is something that we would equate to sport washing. And I'm thinking about, for example, Vladimir Putin. Back in 2014, Russia hosted the Sochi Olympics. He basked in the adulation of being the host to what ended up being, despite a lot of criticism, especially around Russia's repression of LGBTQS individuals. But, Putin's internal approval rating went up. And Russia was feeling very strong about itself. Putin then took that great feeling and invaded Crimea between the Olympics and the Paralympics. So, according to some, he used that as a kind of a jumping off point, having either cleansed his image or certainly improved his image through hosting the Olympics, and used the soft power to then move to the hard power of a military invasion.
In your column, you wrote about a kind of double standard at play when we talk about this phenomenon. The headline, if you'll permit me to read it out loud back to you, is, why do we reserve the term sport washing for repressive regimes and not, say, Coca-Cola? So what should we be thinking about differently here?
Sure, we should be skeptical of Saudi Arabia and its multi-billion-dollar spends in the sports realm, but we also should be skeptical of what corporations, not just globe-straddling corporations like Coca-Cola, are attempting to convince us of. There are reasons that Coke wants to make us feel really good. One of the things it doesn't want to remind us of is that, and this is kind of the irony really that I was just trying to flick at in the column, Coca-Cola is not really the best drink for athletes to be consuming. I'm sorry.
Oh, I got to rethink my whole strategy.
I know I'm going to sound like I'm raining on everybody's parade, but it does belong to this class of beverages that is widely understood to cause heart disease, diabetes, obesity, tooth decay, all kinds of bad health outcomes. So, these things are terrible for you if you consume them with any kind of regularity. Look, Coke is the longest supporting official sponsor of the Olympics, and Coke is the most aggressive brand marketer, I think, in the world when it comes to pairing its image with sports. And it always has been. Back in 1928, they sent 1,000 cases of Coke to the Olympics in the Netherlands, and their first official Olympic sponsorship was at the 1936 Olympics. And these are the ones, of course, held in Berlin, which Adolf Hitler had famously hoped to use to spread the, we'll call it the myth of Aryan supremacy. And
I want to talk more about this, right?
Yeah, please.
Probably the most egregious example of Olympics sport washing was, of course, Berlin hosting the 1936 Games. And to put that in context, this was 3 years after the first concentration camp began operating and 2 years after Hitler abolished the office of the president and declared himself dictator. What do you think the goal was there, and how did it go over on the world stage?
Well, it didn't go over nearly as well as he'd hoped. There are all kinds of films and books written about the way Jesse Owens almost single-handedly destroyed Hitler's ego at the time. But, similar to the way Putin had used the Sochi Olympics, and as you note, Alcibiades used the original Olympic Games to prove to the world that in the case of Athens, that Athenians were superior, and obviously in the case of Hitler, that Aryans were superior.
As a quick follow-up, I feel like we kind of just avoided a repeat of this, right? France is just wrapping up a major election at the time that we're recording this. The outcome is still a little bit uncertain, but there was a real risk that the far right would be in power and kind of then could use the Olympics to legitimize its politics.
Oh, well, it's believed that the Paris Olympics will be one of the most widely viewed games, certainly in probably about a decade. And so, yes, absolutely. We don't yet know, as we're recording this, who will be standing there greeting athletes from around the world as France's government. We expect it'll still be Macron, but we're not sure. And these platforms are very valuable. Look, back in 2022, when China hosted the Beijing Olympics, Putin was there. And he and Xi Jinping were together at the Olympics, and they displayed not just that unity, but that sense of power. These are very powerful platforms and very influential platforms, and we don't yet know what we're going to see in Paris.
Imagine earning a degree that prepares you with real skills for the real world. Capella University's programs teach skills relevant to your career so you can apply what you learn right away. Learn how Capella can make a difference in your life at capella.edu.
So you've pointed to the reputational element for repressive regimes. I wanted to bring celebrity and pop culture here for a second. It's my time to shine. Did you read about Flavor Flav's 5-year sponsorship deal with the U.S. women's water polo team? It felt like it would be if Drake stepped in to sponsor women's field hockey or something like that. What's going on here?
Well, you tell me whether you think Flava Flav's reputation needs cleansing in the same way that Drake's might.
Well, he has a domestic battery charge that was dropped, and he pled no contest to coercion. So, yeah, I definitely think there could be some reputational elements for him. He could just also really love water polo, and maybe women's sports just are less funded.
Well, certainly women's sports are less funded, and they are also the flavor of, of the month. And I hope that it's not just of the month, but, obviously women's sports have become very important for an increasing number of corporations to be seen to be getting behind. But, here in Canada, obviously we saw the launch of the PWHL, the fantastic Professional Women's Hockey League, and companies like Canadian Tire stepped up as founding sponsors because they saw this was good business and you could do good by doing well or do well by doing good. Flava Flav has not said exactly why he's sponsoring, and we don't know a lot about that particular sponsorship or that particular involvement.
Just that it's 5 years, yeah.
It's 5 years, and that he has said he's not getting into the pool, which I think is a good thing. No, look, the increasing use of the term sports washing, I think, has thankfully made us more aware of any time an individual or a corporation or a country is using the platform of sports to do something that they may have ulterior motives for.
Maybe we can talk a little bit more about Saudi Arabia specifically, a country with an abysmal human rights record, pretty much the poster child for sport washing. Saudi Arabia has spent at least $6.3 billion on sport deals between 2021 and 2023, according to an analysis by The Guardian. This includes initiatives like the Asian Winter Games, tennis, cycling, the 2034 FIFA World Cup rights, and this month, esports. What's interesting here is the clarity around the agenda. So Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has said that he, quote, doesn't care about accusations of sport washing against his country. He told Fox News, if sport washing is going to increase my GDP by way of 1%, then I will continue doing sport washing. What are the economics at play here? What is success?
It's not clear exactly what he meant by that comment. I know it has been taken to be, well, hey, sports washing itself is giving us this additional 1.5% of GDP. But the way I heard it, it sounded as if basically what he was saying was, hey, this is just an investment. That is to say, an actual business investment, which is, I think, probably important to separate from sports washing, which is, as we say, a kind of cynical PR move to throw a whole lot of money at something and you would not get that money back. And frankly, if I'm a young Saudi individual, I would want to know what this public investment fund is doing with money that is supposed to belong to me, whether it is being used to cleanse the nation of a bad reputation for murdering journalists and keeping women as second-class citizens, or whether it's an actual good investment from the cash flow perspective.
What is the PIF?
The PIF is Saudi Arabia's public investment fund. It's this fund created, obviously, from their oil wealth. It's worth about $1 trillion American now. And so it allows Saudi Arabia to go around the world and make eye-popping investments in really whatever they want.
Okay. Let's talk about what these business investments mean and feel like for the athletes themselves, because it strikes me that sport washing is not just about buying teams or rights to events. You can also kind of buy people and use them as your own billboard. Ronaldo was paid $213 million to play for Al Nassr. Notably, only a fraction of this relates to him actually playing football, with his image rights and commercial deals reportedly funding more than half of his total earnings. What is Saudi Arabia buying, and how is this different for the players themselves than just wearing a pair of Adidas shoes in an ad campaign?
Well, Rafa Nadal as well recently signed on to be an ambassador for Saudi Arabian tennis. And I think you've hit on something really important here. Ultimately, it's the athletes who are the reason we're watching these sports, and in some cases, the ambassadors and the billboards for these messages. And this is something that I think most acutely has been felt in the WTA, the Women's Tennis Association. For years, they were offered Saudi money and they rebuffed it because, understandably, a lot of WTA members were really not comfortable partnering with a regime where women are treated as second-class citizens. Chris Evert, Martina Navratilova, these are two legends in the game. They said, this is a terrible thing. Our work, our legacy should not be used to cleanse the regime. But another legend of the game, Billie Jean King, suggested or argued that actually engagement, that is to say, having athletes in Riyadh and having athletes speak directly to power, could be a great thing. So back in April, the WTA, sure enough, actually did sign a deal whereby the WTA finals, for the next 3 years are going to be held in Riyadh. And they've bought great PR, but that is a very active conversation. And I think it points to one of the complicating elements of sports washing, which is that, when Qatar hosted the World Cup in 2022, all of a sudden, hundreds of millions of people around the world were suddenly talking about Qatar's terrible human rights record. So you invite not just the great PR and not just, the cleansing of that reflected glory of sports, but you also invite the scrutiny.
So speaking about inviting scrutiny, you've also written about the rise of private equity in sport, pointing out just how weird it is to see the new National Women's Soccer League team.
It's very weird.
AFC in jerseys with the logo for 6th Street, a private equity giant. Hedge funds are supposed to be stealth and private. What's going on? What's being washed here?
Right. So we don't actually know whether it's being washed. 6th Street is the majority owner of Bay FC, which is this new NWSL, National Women's Soccer League team in the Bay Area, Bay FC. So they certainly have a legitimate claim to the brand of that team. But what was unusual is back in April, they became an official jersey sponsor of their own team. And so, the 6th Street logo is on the back. It's a really big logo. It's almost as big as the number on the back of these women's jerseys. And, I also mentioned in that column that we're talking about, there's something called Arctos Partners, which is another private equity firm. It is a partial owner of the Aston Martin F1 team. So their logo appears on the Aston Martin F1 car. And you're like, why are these companies doing this? And your typical NWSL fan is not going to be trying to engage 6th Street, which has $75 billion in assets under management, to, run their fund. It's a very strange thing. But it is, I think, important to note that private equity is becoming a more significant part of our economy, from sports teams to dentists' offices, frankly. So, Vass, I don't know if you have a pet, but you may have noticed, if you do, that your vet is now owned by a private equity firm. Mm-hmm. So it's not unlikely, I think, that some of these firms are feeling like maybe it would be a good time to just kind of start branding the sector, start softening people up to feel good, just as Coke does, to feel good about private equity taking over the economy.
Well, speaking of you and I chasing those good vibes, I'm wondering, we're talking about sport washing now, but does anyone actually care? You wrote in your article about a new Harris poll that showed only 28% of boomers or Gen Xers surveyed believe that oil money in sports is a good thing, while a whopping 61% of millennials and Gen Z believe it's good. So what's going on here? Aren't younger people supposed to be opposed to this kind of thing?
I think, you mentioned esports, Saudi Arabia sponsoring esports. Saudi Arabia understands that if they woo the kids, then they will, from a generational perspective, they will lay the groundwork for Saudi Arabia to be taken as possibly a benevolent force in the sports realm. But having spoken with kids of that age and people in their 30s and their 20s, I don't think it's naivete. I think it's this sense of understanding the way power works now in the world. And I think that generation, unlike perhaps my generation, which still feels good about Coca-Cola, this younger generation is looking at the way money and power works. They're looking at the way their economy has been taken over by some very powerful forces, and they're seeing right through that. And so maybe they're not saying there's no difference between Coca-Cola and Saudi Arabia, but they're saying there's no significant fundamental difference. And so if I feel good about Coke, then why shouldn't I feel good about Saudi Arabia? And maybe they're saying, look, the world is a cynical place. I will engage with Saudi Arabia. I will allow them to take over ownership of my sports team, but I will also recognize that their track record of human rights is a terrible thing. Right. I can hold these two things in my head at the same time because, frankly, plenty of people feel as sports has become taken over, as I say, by private equity. A lot of people don't feel great about that, but they're like, well, what are you going to do? EPL teams are no longer owned by the communities. There are very few NFL or CFL teams that are owned by the communities. And so, okay, this is the trade-off that we make. So what's important is to say, yes, this is something we live with, but we can also say this is not something we agree with and just continue the conversation.
Simon, thanks so much for continuing this conversation with us.
Vass, it's been a pleasure. Thanks.
You've been listening to Lately, a Globe and Mail podcast. Our executive producer is Katrina Onstad. The show is produced by Andrea Varsany, and our sound designer is Cameron McIver. I'm your host, Vass Bednar. And in our show notes, you can subscribe to the Lately newsletter, where we unpack a little more of the latest in business and technology. A new episode of Lately comes out every Friday, wherever you get your podcasts.